लो जी गौरी आया फिर.
So today's topic is ascending tract. Ascending tract. Now what is tract? Tract are the bundle of nerve fibers which carry the information towards the brain or away the brain. Those tracts which carry the information towards the brain are known as the ascending tract. Ascending tract conduct sensory info of two types. Extroceptive, which has a stimulus outside the body, and the proprioceptive inside the body. The ascending tracts can be divided into two types for simplicity, major and minor. Major includes tracts for cerebrum and cerebellum. Cerebrum tracts include the well-known dorsal lemniscus and spinothalamic, which is anterolateral. And the cerebellum, for cerebellum it is anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, cuneocerebellar. Minor tracts include the spinotactile, spinoreticular, and spinocerebellar. We will talk them in a little bit. Simplest order of tracts formation. We start with the receptor, and then the fibers from the receptor synapse with the first order neuron, which is usually the cell body in the posterior root ganglion. Now from this posterior root ganglion, two processes appear: a peripheral process which comes from the receptor, and a central process which moves toward the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now this central process move toward the second order neuron and synapse there, and this second order neuron is the cell in the gray matter. Then fibers from there here move toward the third order neuron, which is usually in the thalamus, third order neuron which is usually in the thalamus, and then the fiber from there move to the final destination, which can either be post-central gyrus of the central cortex in case of cerebrum, or cerebellar cortex in case of cerebellum. Now, before starting, we need to clarify some structures of neurology, human neurology. First of all, this is a spinal cord. It is divided into a dark gray matter and a white matter. The gray matter contains the posterior horn, this is the lateral horn, and the anterior horn. Contains the cell bodies, a collection of cell bodies. Now the white matter contains the fiber and is divided into the anterior funiculus or anterior column, the lateral funiculus or lateral column, and the posterior funiculus or posterior column. Now fun thing about posterior funiculus or column is that it is modern, faster, and contains only ascending tracts. Another thing we need to know before starting is that this is the cerebral cortex. A simple diagram shows that at front is the frontal cortex and behind is the parietal cortex. In between these, there is a line known as the central sulcus, and on both sides of the line are the impressions known as the gyrus. The impression in front of the line is known as precentral gyrus, which has a motor role in the cerebral cortex, and impression behind the central sulcus is post-central gyrus, which has a sensory role. Now, moving towards the tracts for cerebellum. Now, tracts for cerebellum conduct info to the contralateral area, meaning if a tract is taking info from the right side of the body, it will deliver the info to the left area of the brain. We'll see that in a minute. Now, talking first about the lateral spinothalamic tract. Its main role is to conduct pain and temperature. By taking into account the same simplest order we discussed a minute earlier, we can say that starting from the receptor, the lateral spinothalamic pathway starts from the free nerve ending. It contains the type delta A fiber, which has an intermediate speed because it has to conduct pain and temperature. From these fibers, it moves to the cells in the dorsal root ganglion, and from the dorsal root ganglion, it moves towards the posterior horn of the hypothalamus. I have explained earlier what it is. And from there, the fibers ascend to vertebrae in the dorsal horn and then synapse with the substantia gelatinosa cell, which is a collection of cells in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. From the substantia gelatinosa, fibers arise and decussate. Decussation means the fibers on the right side move toward the left side and fibers on the left side move toward the right side. After the decussation, the fibers of the lateral spinothalamic tract move toward the lateral column of the white matter of spinal cord. I have explained this earlier also. So from there, they move towards the ventral posterolateral nucleus of thalamus. Now, what are the ventral posterolateral nucleus of thalamus? For this, I have drawn a simple diagram. This is the right thalamus. It is the interior end, the posterior end. It is divided by a Y-shaped line into three parts: anterior, medial, and lateral. Now, this lateral part is further divided into ventral lateral in the front and the dorsal lateral. And this ventral lateral is further divided into anterior, intermediate, and posterior areas. And this posterior area is further divided into lateral area and medial area. So when we talk about ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, we talk about the ventral nucleus part which is the posterior nucleus and the posterior nuclear part which is the lateral part. So ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus is the contains the third order neuron. Now from there it passes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Now what is the internal capsule? Here is the simple explanation. This is a third ventricle. Here is the thalamus and here is the thalamus and close to the thalamus in the lentiform nucleus. Now between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus is a collection of white matter known as internal capsule. Now this internal capsule has two limbs. Above is the posterior limb and below is the anterior limb. Now since the third order neurons are present in the ventroposterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, so from there these the fibers arise and move and cut the posterior limb and attaches to the cerebral cortex. This whole area is cerebral cortex. So pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule and then they attaches to the post-central gyrus of the sensory cortex, which I have explained earlier. It is this one, the post-central gyrus of the cerebral cortex, which has a sensory role. Now moving towards the anterior hypothalamus. Anterior hypothalamic pathway conducts the crude touch and pressure. So it means it does not require a fast conducting system. So type C fibers, which are non-myelinated and slowest fibers, conduct its impulses from the free nerve ending to the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion is this one. These are the ramus, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, which contain mixed type of nerves. Here is the trunk, and far from the trunk is the root. The dorsal root contains the sensory fiber, and the ventral root contains the motor fiber. So in the dorsal root there is a ganglion known as the dorsal root ganglion, from where fibers move to the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Now free nerve ending, type C fiber to the dorsal root of the ganglion, and from there the fiber ascend two vertebra inside the dorsal horn and then make a synapse with the substantia gelatinosa, which I have explained are the cells in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Now these are the second order neurons. So the fibers from these neurons decussate. Decussate means the fiber from the right side move toward the left side and vice versa. After decussation, they ascend towards the brain in the anterior column of the white matter of the spinal cord. From the anterior column, they move to the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the hypothalamus, I have explained earlier, and then they pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, just like the lateral spinothalamic, and from there they reach the same area, that is the post-central gyrus of the sensory cortex, which has a sensory role. Now moving towards the third, which is the most important, dorsal column medial lemniscus. Now dorsal column medial lemniscus is involved in the discriminative touch. So it should have the fastest type of fibers that is type A alpha and A beta. Now receptor for these is Meissner's receptor, Pixinian receptor, muscle spindle, Golgi tendon, etc. So for proprioceptive impulses. So from there the type A alpha beta fibers move to the dorsal root ganglion, and from the dorsal root ganglion they move toward the posterior horn of the spinal cord, uh, mm, and then in the dorsal column of the white column of the spinal cord. They are arranged in two groups. That is fasciculus. Fasciculus is the bundle of axons. Fasciculus gracilis, which takes the nerve fibers from the lower part of the body and trunk, and fasciculus cuneatus, which is lateral to it and takes impulses from the upper part of the body. Now from these two columns the fibers synapse at the nuclei gracilis from the fasciculus gracilis and nuclei cutaneous from the fasciculus cutaneous. Both of these nucleus are present in the medulla. So second order neuron of the dorsal lemniscus pathway is present in the medulla. From here the fibers arise and decussation occurs. Right side move to the left side and left side move to the right side, and from there the fiber move to the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then again pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule and reach the post central gyrus of the sensory cortex. Now moving towards the tracts for the cerebellum. Now an important part is that the info to the ipsilateral area occur in the cerebellar tracts. Mean to say that if the info is coming from the right side of the body, it will move to the right side of the cerebellum. Now here two types of spinocerebellar and one type of cuneo-cerebellar tracts are involved. The posterior spinocerebellar and anterior spinocerebellar both causes the conduction of unconscious muscle sensation, and the cuneo-cerebellar has the same role, info of the muscle joint sensation. Now these the receptor for these are the muscle spindle, tendon, organ, joint receptor. Same for the anterior spinocerebellum. Both move to the dorsal root ganglion. This also moves to the dorsal root ganglion, and from there it moves to the first order neuron, the second order neuron known as the nucleus dorsalis, which is a collection of cells in the posterior gray horn. Same for the anterior spinocerebellar pathway. Now change occurs from this point in both of them. Now in the posterior spinocerebellar pathway, the fibers goes upward through the medulla pons, through the medulla into the cerebellar cortex. How does it goes into the cerebellar cortex? It goes via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. What is the cerebellar peduncle? The cerebellar peduncle is the bundle of white matter which connects the brainstem to the cerebellum. For simplicity, I have drawn a simple diagram. This is spinal cord, above the medulla, then pons, and then midbrain. Now these circles are the bundle of white matter, that is the cerebellar peduncle, which are connecting this brainstem to the cerebellum. I've drawn that on both sides. So it has three types of peduncles: superior, which connects the cerebellum to the midbrain; intermediate, superior, intermediate, which connects the cerebellum to the pons. Okay. Now inferior, which connect the cerebellum to the medulla. Now in case of posterior spinothalamic pathway, the fibers reach the cerebellar cortex by passing through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Means that they reach at the level of the medulla and then move to the cerebellar cortex through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now in case of anterior spinothalamic pathway, everything was all right here, and then difference occurred. Now majority of their fibers at the level of nucleus dorsalis decussate, but reaches the same side of the cerebellar cortex. How does it occur? It occurs that they decussate. If they are present on that side, they move after decussation to this side, and then first moves through the superior spinocerebellar cerebellar peduncle here like this, and then they moves through the middle cerebellar peduncle to the same side of the cerebellum. I'll explain it furthermore later. Let me tell you a diagram. Look, these are the anterior spinocerebellar tracts. It divides in majority decussates while the minority doesn't decussate. The majority with decussates move upward and enter the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and then exits the cerebellum through the intermediate cerebellar peduncle, and then enters the cerebellum or its own side, ipsilateral side, through the middle cerebellar peduncle. So it decussates and then round it goes and went to the same cerebellum which is present its same side. While the minority of the anterior spinocerebellar tract goes upward up to the midbrain and enter the cerebellum of its own side through the superior cerebellar peduncle, as explained here. Minority don't decussate, move to the cerebellar cortex of its own side via the superior cerebellar peduncle. While talking about the cuneo-cerebellar, it takes info from the muscle joint sensation. Now, close to the cuneate nucleus of the medulla, which takes fibers from the fasciculus cuneatus, taking the information from the lower limb, from the upper limb. So there is close to the cuneate nucleus, there is an accessory cuneate nucleus of medulla, close to the cuneate nucleus. We have talked about it earlier. The fibers arise and move to the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar cortex, which is the cerebellar peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the medulla. So they reach the medulla, pass through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and enter the cerebellum. Now, talking about the minor tracts of the cerebellum. First of all, there is spinotectal. Spinotectal, the start occurs from the posterior root ganglion and end occurs at the superior colliculus. Superior colliculus is what? It is a swelling, one of the swelling on the back of the midbrain. One of the swelling on the back of the midbrain. What is the role of the spinotectal? It provides afferent info for the spino-visual reflex. What is the spino-visual reflex? It is the movement of the eye towards the visual stimulus, eye and the head also. Now the spino-reticular tract, it starts from the posterior root ganglion just like this and ends at the reticular formation. What is the reticular formation? Reticular formation is a part of brainstem. Brainstem includes the medulla, pons and midbrain. So it is a part of them which act as an on-off switch. On-off switch what? It influences the level of consciousness. Means to say that, for example, it decreases the level of hearing when you are sleeping. So it is acting as the off switch and increases the level of hearing when you are awake. So last tract, the spino-olivary tract, it moves from the posterior root of the posterior root ganglion and ends at the inferior olivary nucleus. Inferior olivary nucleus is a mass of gray matter in the medulla. What is its role? Spino-olivary pathway provides cutaneous and proprioceptive info of organ to the cerebellum. Now a quick recap. Ascending tracts are the tract which contains sensory information from the lower body to the brain stem, to the brain itself. Contains the exteroceptive outside the body and proprioceptive inside the body stimulus. Now we have divided ascending tracts into major and minor tracts. Talking about for cerebellum, we have divided into dorsal lemniscus, which contains the impulses for the discriminative touch and proprioception, and spinothalamic, including the anterolateral. Lateral causes the pain and temperature sensation, while the anterior causes the crude touch sensation, including this. Now for the cerebellum, we have talked about the spinocerebellar, anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, and cuneo-cerebellar. cerebellum, all of which are involved in the unconscious sensation of joint mobility, joint movements. Now talking about the minor tracts, we have talked about the spinotactile, which is involved with the spinovisual reflex. Now we have talked about the spinoreticcular, which are involved in the influencing the consciousness. I have given the example that increasing the hearing after awaking or decreasing the hearing, and at last the spino-olivary, which are involved in the cutaneous and proprioceptive info transmission to the cerebellum. And that's all for today. Thank you.
Yep.